I'm Dr. Arlen Myers, and I'm the president and CEO of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, and welcome to another edition of this combined ABAIM and SoPE more conversation office hours to discuss various topics and aspects of interest in digital health entrepreneurship, particularly as it relates to artificial intelligence. So just a couple of housekeeping things. If you're not speaking, please turn off your microphone. And then if you want to ask a question, please do raise your hand or raise your hand in the chat, send us a chat, do something that gets our attention, and then we can entertain your question. Anthony, do you want to say hi?
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome, everybody. And good to see everyone always. And since the people that come to these are different every single time, the conversation is always unique and very different and insightful for me. And I do apologize ahead of time. I have to talk to a parent about his daughter in clinic before I start clinic. So I'll be leaving a little bit early, about 15 minutes early. But yeah, great to see everyone. Hi, Alex. Hi, Maurice. Hi, Deepak.
Yep.
Hi, Laura.
Yeah. And I'm pleased to have for this session, Dr. Joe Morgan. Hi, Joe.
Morning.
So Joe, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of maybe a brief description of your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a practicing anesthesiologist. I'm president and founder of a company called Wellovate. Our main product is Waya Health. We essentially go by Waya Health. The company is Wellovate. And I am happily married and a father of a 6-year-old boy. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And my entrepreneurial journey started about 5.5 years ago when I got a virtual reality headset for recreational purposes, and quickly started to realize all of the different elements that could be really useful in a healthcare context. And so one thing led to another. And for the past 5+ years, we've been in the extended reality for healthcare space.
Great. So what was your, I mean, it obviously, it's not an easy journey. What did you encounter when you first started this? Like, what were the barriers and issues, and how'd you overcome them and all that?
Yeah, so the issues that we encountered as a brand new company are a lot different than the issues that we're running into now. You know, the modern era of extended reality, meaning, you know, extended reality that's kind of able to scale on relatively low cost devices and so forth, has really only been around for about 5.5, 6 years. And so for the first several years that we were trying to, you know, essentially find a customer, and that took about, you know, 1.5, 2 years before we even had anyone willing to buy our product. You know, we're kind of coming out of obscurity in some sense. You know, the technology and everything was there, but the understanding in healthcare of what it could do to help patients was not there. And over the past 5 years, we've really seen that change significantly.
And so what you're describing is sort of a form of a sort of first to market challenge versus a fast follower, which I guess now is, I mean, this thing changes so quickly. From the time someone first enters to the time you're a fast follower is like 6 months. It just grows very quickly. So what were the specific issues you had to encounter as a first to market, and more specifically as a startup? Because everybody asks, how do I get my first customer? How do I open doors? How do I get a pilot? How do I find a champion? All that stuff. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the part of it was, and we found that this is really what we needed to get over the hurdle, was having good answers, evidence-based answers, or answers with references with regards to the common questions that came up. So, for example, one of them was, when approaching a facility that had older patients, for example, oh, well, we have a lot of older folks and we don't know if they're going to even be able to use this because it's a real technologically based thing. And well, it turns out that specific example was an easy answer, which is that older folks are just as interested as younger folks in using technology, provided that they're given, a basic explanation and not written off. And so, that was a common question. And, before we had a well hashed out answer to that question, that single issue could kind of be a game stopper. So, it's items like that. Other issues were safety concerns, cleaning concerns, hygiene, and so forth. And over time, after, really what you're doing in the very beginning is, whether you like it or not, it's customer exploration. You're speaking with people, and, the goal is to talk about, their life and the problems they're encountering, and, not your solution. And really having a really good handle on what problems somebody's encountering, what items would be able to address those problems. And then, once you get past those items, then it's really about addressing the concerns or the barriers that would be preventing them from purchasing your product.
Yeah, so what you're saying essentially is we're trying to emphasize this over and over again. It's more important to understand the problem than the solution, practice design thinking. And what did you do to test your business ideas?
Yeah,
another-
so really beautiful.
Yeah, somebody needs to mute their mic, please. Thanks. Go ahead. Okay, or is that you, Joe?
No, it's not me.
All right, yeah. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
So testing business ideas. Yeah. So basically, as physicians, we have a lot of colleagues that we can, bounce things off of. And, us being in a healthcare space, it was easy to get some colleague opinions. And so the very first, iteration of bringing forward what we thought was a viable product was really with friends and colleagues that we work with, and getting their input and getting their take on whether they would buy something. But to take a step back, our approach was not at all a traditional startup approach, and that has to do with simply the fact that it was very, very early days when we got started, and as a result of that, we really were trying to map out the trajectory of the market, and really develop things in a way that would make sense going forward. So whereas a traditional startup, for example, a two-dimensional digital health app or something like that, it makes a lot of sense to come up with a business plan, raise money, do all that stuff early on after you have a minimum viable product and so forth, and move forward. We took a very a-traditional approach. And, I can't say whether that's right or wrong, but, early on, we made some assumptions about the market, and, those sort of high-level assumptions really helped us, really helped inform our decision-making. And looking back, a lot of those, luckily, were the right move. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First is, we're at a certain place in the hype cycle, certainly with extended reality, but, I would argue that we're on the sort of second iteration of the hype cycle. In 2015, 2016, when these devices were first coming out, that was the first iteration of the hype cycle. And there were a lot of businesses that tried to go the traditional route and have since went belly up already. And so all of that being said, it was really about looking at where the market was going. How is it going to mature? How are the devices going to evolve? For example, we were starting out with tethered devices, and now we have standalone devices, which is a totally different user experience. One is very clunky and barely, viable from a from a clinical workflow standpoint, whereas a standalone unit is very simple. Put it on your head and turn it on. And so all of those things combined really, you know, that was the sort of batch of decisions and contextual situations that we were in. And so, like I said, our path is somewhat atraditional. We're a bootstrap company. We did not go out and raise venture capital, although, you know, we're starting to think about, you know, accelerating now that the space has reached a certain level of maturity. And certainly for the past year and a half, 2 years, decision makers in this space they understand what we're doing, they understand the concept. Whereas 5 years ago, you know, it was really, really hard to get the point across as to what you're trying to do and how it benefits people.
Okay, so are there any questions up till now from the audience? If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can unmute your mic. Or put it in the chat or something. Okay. Oh, Flora?
Hey Joe, it's good to see you again.
Yeah,
Hey, Flora.
good to see you.
Yeah,
What's your question?
yeah. So your company sounds really interesting, and I'm just like wondering. I'm trying to figure out like what like one of these scenarios would be. Like, what would they do? Let's say if you have a senior in a home, like they put this on, and then what does it do, and how does it help them?
Yeah. So walk us through a typical use case, Joe.
Yeah, so that's a great example. So somebody in a senior living scenario. So we call senior living things like skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, and so forth. So a person puts it on, and you know it's all use case specific. And you know the reason why our company has a distinct advantage, being largely comprised of physicians compared to other companies that maybe have, you know. A bunch of technologists and business folks, and maybe have somebody who's a advisor who's clinically oriented. Is our experiences from the ground up are kind of designed for and intended to be used in a particular clinical workflow for a particular clinical purpose. And so, you know, senior care is a great example where the focus is mental and physical stimulation. It's relieving feelings of isolation and boredom. And things like that. And so that example is really a great one in that we have sort of multi-use case examples where, you know, we're trying to help in various different ways. And those really fall under the umbrella of patient experience and quality improvement. And then we have sort of very focused use cases, for example, that are much more aligned with an indication, so to speak, something like acute pain or anxiety and so forth, which have to go a much different route of validation, obviously, and the context in which you use those various different more formalized use cases are much better defined. But it's a good example of, you know, the broader type of use case, which is really focused on helping the patient, you know, relieve feelings of boredom, address various different things that, you know, certainly could be used for discomfort or stress, but, you know, basically providing a much better experience for the person staying within a facility.
Okay. How do you, I want to talk about the shiny new object syndrome. So how did you get your first customer?
Yeah, so our first customer basically was a pure coincidence. I spoke with a locum surgeon who was working at our hospital, who knew somebody who basically set up a demo at another hospital. I did a demo, and it was a very small order. I think it was 2 or 3 units. And, you know, one thing led to another. We very narrowly focused on providing them with, excellent service and support, and listened very closely to what their feedback was and acted on it. And so that grew, and one thing led to another. That's essentially, how we got started. And when we got started, our very first iteration was using gaming laptops, AV carts, and tethered headsets. So it was an extremely clunky setup. We've watched things evolve, obviously, over the past several years.
So what's the bottom line? What's the advice to the people on this call about how do I find my first customer?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the space you're working in. I think if you're working in a space that's emerging, then I highly recommend having the first customer, be or viewing that potential first customer as the people you're doing exploration with. So in other words, you have a good contact who might be interested in the technology, they're willing to talk to you, and really getting a good explanation of what their daily problems are, and really trying to have your solution be focused on that sort of painful problem that they're facing, because and this is distinct again from a more mature market where a lot of situations, what you need to do or the product or the thing you're addressing is a little less opaque, I guess is a good way to say it. So so if you're an emerging space, then the approach is really a lot different.
So you brought up a couple concepts. One is the value of networking, which is kind of self-explanatory. I mean, you knew someone who knew someone who knew someone, and boom, you had a customer. Two, in the early stages, sort of engaging the initial customer as a co-developer of the product. So what incentives did you offer the first customer to do that?
Yeah, so the incentives really were not financially, they weren't of a financial nature. They were more of a ongoing feedback and getting their information, getting their advice, getting their feedback, and then acting on it. So the way we kind of had stickiness with them was really through our actions in the relationship. Once we were formally engaged with them, we took it very seriously, and it was the first several sprints after we closed that contract, we were narrowly focused on incorporating their feedback, really for usability and for ease of integration into the workflow. That was the first several iterations after we signed on with them, as opposed to going on and trying to find the next client immediately.
Deepak, do you have a question?
Sorry, yes. I just wanted to know how many pilots is considered reasonable before you start, charging clients.
Okay. So Joe, let's back up a minute. Did you do pilots?
We did our first effort was a paid client. So no. So, and that's it. We have pilots for more formal use cases, but for our initial go at it, in a quality improvement context, our first go at it was a paid client.
Which is a little bit unusual, because these days, most anything you sort of have to pilot, particularly in digital health. And I guess Anthony, do you have any comments about that? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, as one of the epicenters of AI projects and digital projects, we get approached once or twice a day by a startup or a company that wants to offer something for free. but they almost always fail to realize that it sounds really, it's like a no-brainer, but the thing is we have to expend manpower and resources to accommodate that quote unquote free service. And I'm just shocked that they almost always don't realize that it's not a trivial amount of resources and money. So maybe that's something that these startups can actually take
Yeah.
into account when they present, that it's not free for the hospital.
So let's talk a little bit about pilots, Anthony. The issues really have to do with what you just mentioned, like how do you find someone willing to do the pilot? Once you do, then how do you avoid, for example, what I call being in pilot purgatory? You do the pilot, but things get so screwed up that you're basically a pilot zombie. It just never gets done. The right people don't manage it. It never delivers what you thought it would. You got to deal with IT, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the whole business model of the pilot, because some folks, like a hospital or a care innovation center, may want a piece of your company if the pilot is successful and it is integrated into their network. So can you address some of those issues?
I suppose there are some general tenets, but depending on the level of involvement from the hospital, if it's a device, which is at the other end, at one end of the spectrum, if it's a device that involves patients and you have to worry about efficacy and safety and everything, then the hospital is going to want a very big stake in the company. If it's something that's just in terms of getting access to data, but without really involving patients directly, then it's usually a single digit in the stake in the company in terms of equity. But most hospitals, as you probably know, also are ultra conservative when it comes to equity stake because they're not familiar with it. They think it might be, and I think they mistakenly think that this is a liability for them from a legal perspective, and just not familiar with that territory like Silicon Valley would be. So they're not really used to equity stake, and oftentimes they rather have some sort of direct money dividend for the time that people have to spend to take care of the pilot project. So it's very, very cumbersome to work in a health system because of that. That business model is not really mature yet, in my opinion. But the most important thing for the startups is they absolutely have to have a very strong clinician champion. Otherwise, it doesn't, if there's not a single champion that people can point to describe and take care of the project, it's going to just die of lack of momentum.
Maurice, you've probably had some experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You want to share anything?
Well, we are right in the middle of a clinical EUA trial. So yes, within our current company, we are facing, as you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the blinded. But over the last 15 years working with companies in the med dev world, their biggest problem has been containment more than engagement for product. Keeping the information contained within their trials until they have approval, particularly in the EU, and rather than the issues of getting a champion out there to bring the product into market once they get their approvals. And I think that's possibly because they're mostly I've worked with class 3 devices, so they've had very long trial periods with multiple sites. People, physicians already know the technology or at least have heard about it. They want it. They're concentrating in areas where patients were otherwise underserved already. So in many cases, it's the only one or maybe one of only 2 or 3 options that have developed in the last 5 years. And so the first one to market gets the market, the second one to market catches everybody else, and it's the third one that ends up having to really fight and struggle. But that, again, that's one consultant's experience.
Yeah, and And this issue of, I mean, the question was before you start charging the client. And I mean, again, the business model of the pilot has to be determined before you do the pilot. It's not like, let's see how this works, and then we're going to, I mean, it may be that way, but there's so many iterations and variations in how these pilots are conducted as you're listening that you have to sort of get that squared away up front. Now, the other tip is, while we're talking about hospital as pilot partners, there's certainly lots of other entities that could be pilot partners. For example, employers who have self-insured employees. For example, insurance companies that have obvious stakes in reducing cost of care, et cetera, med tech companies, biopharma companies, et cetera. And if you're providing, like in the case of Joe, so for example, let's say that I mean, my understanding of your business, Joe, is just basically two parts to it, hardware and software. And you take off the shelf hardware, like an Oculus or something, but your fundamental business is software, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So we are hardware agnostic. We use a game engine, and our sort of style of coding is such that we're able to put our software on any device that's out there at present. And so that's correct. And so, you know, part of it is like having what some people in the business world refer to as like a whole product solution. So making things very easy for the client to buy, having things set up in a turnkey fashion so that, you know, although we're not a hardware company, you're kind of taking care of the, you know, the hardware loading, the kitting of everything, and making it a true turnkey solution. And then doing things that make it a whole product solution, which really means things like providing the necessary accompanying materials, giving guides on how to use things, how to clean the hardware, provider tutorials, patient handouts, all of that stuff, so that you know, both the provider is more apt to use it, and then the patient is more apt to be interested in it.
Okay, so as an example, if I'm a virtual or extended reality or a metaverse hardware creator, and I have a hardware product that is specifically designed for sick care and is specifically designed for the aged senior population. And I want to do a pilot with you because I think you need a better, smarter, faster, cheaper headset. So what are you thinking? As a vendor, what are you looking for in the pilot?
Yeah. So what am I looking for in the pilot? You know, what am I looking for to get out of it, or what am I looking for in terms of the particulars of the?
Well, when I approach you and I say, I want to do a pilot with you, and you say either, gee, that sounds great, or there's no way in God's creation I'm doing this pilot. What's going through your mind as to how you're going to make that decision?
Yeah. Okay. That's actually a relatively straightforward question in that the simplest path to what adds value or what is perceived as adding value to our client base. And so I always view it as a hierarchy. Certainly in the private sector, I think the things that resonate most with private sector entities in healthcare in order are, you know, a pitch that is going to increase top line revenue, and then a gap, and then something that's going to save significantly in cost, and then there's a gap, and then number three is improving patient outcomes. Now that is, you know, it sounds somewhat cynical, but you know, that's what we've observed in my experience, and you know, but the faster the route, to answer your question, I think the faster and simpler the route is to, you know, bringing one of those things to the proverbial table, the more attractive it is, in my opinion.
Yeah, so what you've been describing is referred to as a minimally viable pilot. And fundamentally, the minimally viable pilot is designed to answer as cheaply and fast as possible the main key performance indicator you're trying to demonstrate. It could be money, it could be quality, it could be the quadruple aim, whatever. But the point is, stay focused. What are you trying to prove through the pilot as quickly and cheaply as possible? And that's what you need to think through. It's just like a minimal viable product, but it's a minimal viable pilot. And there's several articles that there's a Harvard Business Review article on how to conduct a minimally viable pilot and what gets in the way and why it don't work and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of stuff out there. So I would encourage you to kind of look into that. Doro, you have a question, and then we'll get to Faiza.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Joe, for the interesting presentation. I was just wondering, so
Could you introduce yourself, please?
hi, my name is Doreen. I'm originally from Germany, now in Texas. I run the Dr. Doro Institute, a healthcare consulting agency. We work on a variety of projects. So I was wondering about specific liability concerns. How do you do to protect yourself and your staff and the patient?
Right, so there's
Yeah.
two parts to that question. One is medical malpractice liability. The second is product liability. So how do you protect yourself from that?
Yeah, so the first point is that the providers are ultimately the ones that are using this, right? And they are ultimately the ones that are following their clinical judgment. And we make it very clear that nothing supersedes that, of course. But then we also provide things that are kind of guardrails in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then, there's a lot of elements that relate to the actual design of the experiences and how things are set up themselves. So, for example, none of our experiences to date are what we call involving displacement. In other words, getting your butt out of the chair or a hospital bed or a bedside chair. And that's simply because, of the physical injury concern. And so, everything we do is seated. And, a lot of that has to do with, knowing what aspects of the technology are going to be useful in which situations. So we would, and we have experiences where movement in 3D space is something we do, but that's an augmented reality experience. So that, you're not occluding the real world. That is more of a sort of product-based approach with respect to institutional type concerns. A lot of those really surround, especially the last 2 years, have surrounded cleaning and infectious disease control and concerns like that. And what we really decided early on is that we should not treat this any different than anything else within a healthcare workflow. So rather than going into for example, ultraviolet light cleaning or this or that, we just said, use an electronics approved wipe on the device. If it's good enough to use on an ultrasound, it's good enough to use on these devices. The risk for us was that we had no empirical data as to whether the wipe was going to essentially degrade the device faster, but it hasn't. And we know that those, for example, the gray top cavi wipes, with those of you who use ultrasound and have cavi wipes know what I'm talking about. That workflow has worked well for us over the past few years. So there's liabilities that relate to a variety of different things. And, a lot of that was handled and decided before we ever rolled out with our first client.
Good, thanks for that. Tanvir, you had a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and show us who you are?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we
Yes.
can. Can you tell us, just introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, this is Tanvir Saida Mahmood. I'm a member of the ABAIM board, and I've been participating in the reviews last year. This is my first time joining this particular forum. So
Welcome.
I'm from IBM Research, and I do research in AI and for healthcare.
Great. So what is your question?
I think the question I posed already on the chat, which was regarding the regulatory concerns for,
Right.
we in research also develop technologies and conduct clinical studies, but we don't get to the stage of actually, commercially rolling it out because we are from research organization. So, and one of those concerns have always been the regulatory concerns since we don't get involved in those processes. So I was just wondering how
Okay.
the companies are
So,
navigating those.
Right. Thanks for your question. Maurice, do you want to give us a brief statement? You've already graciously put a lot of stuff into the chat, and we could have a whole seminar on this, but what's the bottom line?
The bottom line, I think, is that that prudence demands you get with your regulatory people. Make sure you have a regulatory path, number one, prospectively. Number two, once you have that, get with your regulatory agency, and you should have a good liaison with that agency, whether that's a consultant liaison or a relationship you've developed in pre-cert, where you can ask a question by email and get an answer. Finally, if you're dealing with FDA, there is an anonymous, I call it the safe harbor box. They call it the anonymous box for digital health that is designed specifically to ask questions without harming your company or the view of FDA of your product. And you can ask anything up to and including, look, I want to take my product, I think it's digital health, and here is the IFU, and here is the product description, and I think that it's an exempt digital health device, and would you concur? Now, they won't give you a concur, but what they will do is they will give you a fast track set of instructions to get that answer in 2 weeks. And you'll get a determination from FDA that says, yeah, you can take this thing to market right now, it's exempt. Or no, it falls under regulatory discretion. Remember that almost all software as medical device and software in medical device. So with or without purpose-built or COTS hardware falls into FDA and EU to Med and Canada Health regulatory discretion, because they have not finished writing the regulations. They were writing them in 2018-19, along comes coronavirus, and they stopped. The Australians are far ahead of us, as are the South Africans, in getting those, and most of Asia are far ahead of us in having the regulatory guidance written. But yeah, as far as EU, United States, most of the rest of North America, it is the wild, wild west, and you want to ask. There's no harm in asking. Don't be afraid of these agencies. You want to ask, because if you step outside the lines, you're done.
Good. Thanks for that. Very helpful comments. So Joe, what'd you do?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great point, and I can't emphasize enough the value of having somebody on your team from very early on that can help in guiding those decisions. And we have two folks. We have a formal FDA consultant, and then we also have somebody on our team who is an MD, JD, and has done lots of work in the regulatory and compliance space. And so Maurice made a great point that, you can always ask, and, the items that we're commercializing are all clearly exempt or just are straight up not a medical device. And so like and our pipeline for items that we know are either class 2 where they've indicated that they're gonna use enforcement discretion, or maybe even further towards the formal definition of something that would be regulated. All of those items, we're taking a much more measured approach. And what we're doing right now is we have several efforts where we're essentially conducting, a pilot type investigation to gather data in a trial that's analogous to a phase 1 type investigation.
So what is your product defined as? Is it a medical device?
So it depends on the use case. So the use case, if the use case is like, for example, pain, that it can be a medical device. Now, the way that these things are viewed is, how are you marketing it? How are you commercializing it? Language you're using when you're marketing it, and those sorts of things. And one of the issues very early on was the utter lack of predicates in our space. But now there's starting to be some predicate work that's completed in particularly in pain. And a lot of the rehabilitation stuff, fortunately, has a predicate for it. And one particular question that's kind of a niche thing within extended reality is that, and we had this question very early on and spent a lot of time looking into it, was, where there are use cases that are out and about, but they're not using like a headset, they're not a 3-dimensional virtual reality implementation, is a predicate that uses a 2-dimensional medium a valid predicate? And, I imagine that it depends on the particulars of what you're talking about, but for the implementations we were looking at that really involved kind of guiding somebody through rehabilitation type exercises, there were existing predicates out there, and those were determined to be exempt in a very formal way by the FDA. So, that's generally been our approach. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of, looking into these things prospectively and having somebody on your team who's an expert in this space, because you're really wasting a ton of time and money if you're trying to go do things, without having that expert opinion on board.
Great, thanks for that. So Faiza, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I want to ask that how will there be a pathway for non-English speakers, and will there be a use case for the resource-limited countries like Pakistan or India if we want to implement this there or introduce this facility there? So what will be there?
Yeah, so this is the whole question of diversity, equity, inclusion of digital health, crossing the digital divide, underserved populations. Joe, what's the short answer?
The short answer is yes. I mean, we've actually done a Spanish speaking implementation. And so, there's within our platform, there's 2 elements that are language specific. That is the text instructions and the voiceovers that we use within our platform. And so for one implementation, one client, they wanted a Spanish speaking option. So that was not a hard exercise for us to do. And the way things are set up for us, we can do that very quickly.
Okay. Before we forget, if people on this call want to get back or in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah. So my email address is jmorgan@wellovate.com.
And maybe you can put that in the chat if you would,
Absolutely.
please.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to, the last section, I want to talk a little bit about the future. We're starting to hear a lot about a whole bunch of stuff. Artificial intelligence, obviously, interoperability, Cures Act, Web 3.0, the metaverse, the value-based care. I mean, it's just coming at us like it's crazy. So what are your thoughts about shiny new objects in the future as far as it impacts your product?
Yeah. So it's been really bizarre for me being in this space for 5+ years over the past 6 months or so, since I think Meta's announcement in October. And so first of all, what is the metaverse? Just so we can have a somewhat grounded discussion here. And I have a definition in front of me that is probably the one that makes the most sense to me. But first of all, so everyone understands, like, the industry itself has yet to agree upon a clearly defined definition. But a metaverse is, it's an ecosystem of digital assets and content with interoperability across the spectrum of virtual world and the real world. And the two key features there are persistence and location. So in other words, if you have a digital dragon and it's in the street, you come back a year later and it's still there if no one has done anything with it in the virtual world. So those seem to be the real two salient features of what constitutes a metaverse. There's a lot of efforts to inject things like blockchain and non-fungible tokens and things like that to either monetize or to bring various different aspects related to data integrity. But at its core, the two main features are persistence and location. And I would say that this is probably one of the most misused terms I've seen. Granted, I've kind of been paying attention to it very closely since over the past 6 months, and it's used by everyone and for things that relate nothing to any definition of metaverse. And so, to Arlen's point, the shiny new object, I think one of the biggest red flags that somebody could put out there nowadays really relates to this thing where I've seen, startups do it, where it's almost like a mixed bag of words related to various different exponential technologies. Like, you'll hear blockchain or AI. AI was, at HIMSS about a year ago, it was like out of 1,500 companies there that were vendors, it was something obscene, like 1,300 plus of them said they were AI companies. And so you knew it was, just people trying to ride the hype wave. And so I think it can really, you can do yourself a big disservice. And it's a fine line, especially if you genuinely are doing something, in a flashy space or a sexy space, whatever. And so it's really, you have to know your stuff, and adding these sorts of things just to be able to use the buzzword is not a good approach.
Okay. And do you have any comments about Web 3.0? So for those that don't understand, and we're just beginning to sort of understand this, it's early in the hype cycle, but as my understanding is, it's sort of an alternative, obviously, not Web 1.0, 2.0. 3.0 incorporates blockchain and kind of decentralizes it. Do you have any thoughts about the impact of that on extended reality?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of these things, in terms of the business model, I think that so for example, there's one coin out there that's HLTH, I think it's called, and all of these things are really potentially transformative, but they all rely on a critical mass of adoption. And if they don't reach that critical mass of adoption, then they're they might be worthless. So I think if blockchain, if these sorts of things really, grab hold, then there will be a large shift. But a related point is that, I think blockchain may have some wind taken out of its tires recently because of a recent move by the government, and rightfully so in some aspects, to tax those types of I guess instruments. And so and again, there's two flavors, or there's two uses really, in my opinion, for those types of for blockchain and related things. It's either monetization or something related to data integrity, whether it's like a utility coin, you know, where it's tied to some sort of physical aspect or service, or whether it relates to, you know, we know that, you know, this person, you know, is the one using this, and so forth. So that's about all. I'm no expert in blockchain, yeah, but you know, you have to ask yourself, what is it bringing to what you're doing, and have a basic understanding of, you know, why that would be relevant, or why that would help what you're trying to do.
Yeah. So in the brave new world, let's fast forward, and we're doing value-based care, and there is complete and total data interoperability and transparency. And let's say we're doing a somewhat better job in cybersecurity. So now we have this, what I call cyber world. Some would call it a variation of the metaverse. But my question is, so if I'm a patient in a nursing home using your product, I am essentially giving you data like everybody else, whether you're signing on to Google and searching something or using your product in a nursing home. Ultimately, you are giving away your private healthcare information. In the brave new world, the idea is that's not going to happen anymore. My information is very valuable and becoming more valuable. So I should be able to monetize it. And if I give you my data, like a video stream in a virtual reality headset, that's worth something. How are you going to deal with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree. And I think ultimately it comes down to data provenance and who, you know, whether it's worth something or not. And then, you know, do you own it and do you control it as the patient in this example? And so
and more important, and how do I get compensated for it? I want to be paid for you using my data.
Right. And so, and I think, you know, that actually is that if that were to be reality tomorrow, I would view that as a strong positive, simply because things can happen a lot faster, provided that you have the financial resources in order to be able to compensate people for said data. I think it would kind of open up the ability to validate things a lot faster. But then you have kind of a concern about, you know, how is this valid? I compensated you for this data, right? And, you know, but this data was used as part of a clinical effort. And there's a separation there with, you know, some sort of technological instrument, whether it's a blockchain or so forth. But, you know, it's not with its own set of potential issues. But yeah, I mean, I would welcome that more than I would be concerned about it, simply because ultimately patients having control and a monetized value of their data, I think would only help things along. I think it would remove a lot of bureaucratical hurdles and things like that. And it's always a sort of there's always a level of tension between, you know, our desire to be paternalistic and not let patients, you know, potentially do harm to themselves, and giving them autonomy. And so I think that's really the fundamental issue where a lot of these questions lie.
Yeah, so one of the ideas is to use blockchain to reward patients with cryptocurrency tokens for donating their data.
Yep.
And there was a previous question about research, and there are multiple examples of patients donating stuff to improve, including parts of their body, to improve the future of medical science. I mean, just, you go and you give platelets. They don't pay you. I mean, when I was in med school, they paid me for all kinds of fluids. Maybe you too, but generally people, they give blood, they give plasma, they give an organ, they give all kinds of stuff. So I suspect a significant percentage would give, maybe it's on your, I don't know, whatever, it's on your driver's license. And so you give, so if it's a research effort, maybe this gets traction, and I'm sure there are patients that want to be paid for it. So there's kind of they're on the end of a spectrum. If they're altruistic or greedy, let's not call them greedy. They want to be appropriately compensated. But that's kind of how I see this playing out. And a question was, is there a company that sells sample de-identified EMR data? Actually, there is a platform, what I call the Patient Data Exchange. It's like the Chicago Community Commodities Exchange, where data is bought and sold on a commodities market. And it runs like a stock exchange, except you're trading data instead of corn futures or soybeans or pigs. So and there's several companies, and of course there are lots of companies that sell your data without you knowing about it. So I think this thing is the infrastructure for this is starting to evolve. It's kind of off the radar screen at this point, but it's becoming more and more prominent. And again, it's just another element of the convergence of these technologies that complicates the ecosystem.
Can I give an idea? Besides someone volunteering it for goodwill, there could be the equivalent of how we watch programs on TVs. You either are stuck with the advertising and get it for free, or you pay a subscription fee. So you could have other models. There could be the, I'm doing this for science and to help people, but there could be the model of, I'm willing to put up with donating my data if I get it for free or I get it early, and then there could be the paid model where and in a balance, it's very hard to say, when should you be paid when you get something versus, yes, I'm giving you some data back. Where's the discount, or what? It could be a discounted model, but there's probably several things you could bring in there.
Yeah, you could do that. And in fact, the value of the data varies. So for example, I have high blood pressure. Well, so do a gazillion other people. And yeah, it would be a useful data point. But if I have an orphan disease, that's a different story.
Right.
That's probably worth 10 to 15x to a pharma company. So it really depends on the value of the data. It's like the value of the crude.
Yeah,
like
but
some crude has less sulfur in it than others.
But what they're studying is going to potentially be the only thing to save your life or make you functional. You still might want to get in that study, even pay them or drag yourself and hope you
Exactly.
get paid.
You might want to pay them. Yeah, whatever. But I'm agreeing with everything everybody's saying. The models are evolving. It depends, like everything else. But ultimately, we're going to get to a point where this data for dollars model, that is, you give me like Google, you give me your data and I use it to make a ton of money for Google and you get nothing out of it. That's not going to work in sick care in the future, in my view. We're going to have to rethink this model.
And I would just add that I think, if anyone's thinking about just the viable business models, I think that for one or two players that, where widespread adoption occurs in this sort of scenario, I think they will probably be handsomely rewarded. But I think that there will be a bunch of attempts and a bunch of blockchains that, try to do these things. And, anything along these lines, it's really, we're talking about networks of data, networks of people. It relies on a critical mass of adoption. So there's a line in the sand.
Okay, well, we're out of time. This has been a very interesting conversation. Joe, thanks a million for educating us and informing us about your product and your company and your journey. Best of luck.
My
You want
pleasure.
to give a final pitch about your deployment in the VA?
Yeah, so we're really excited. We've got a huge deployment that we just finished. I'll just give a quick 20-second story. So it's been a real transformative 6 months for us as a company. It's a very exciting time, and 5 years of really super hard work on top of being an anesthesiologist. It was probably the most gratifying thing I've ever experienced to see an empty UPS truck come to our business location because they needed an empty truck to be able to fit all the units that we were shipping out. And so that was really, kind of a nice moment for us as a company. And that was in the recent past. So it's very exciting times, and I really appreciate everyone dialing in today.
Thanks very much for sharing, and we'll see you next time. Have a good weekend.